everyone, welcome to Plato Elevate Summer Summit. My name is Balki and I'm a Director of Engineering at Shogun. Shogun is a globally distributed remote company and we help e-commerce merchants offer wonderful experiences for their customers. And I'm super excited to introduce you to Oliver Heckmann. Oliver is the recently appointed Head of Engineering at Coda. But before that, his career spanned many countries and companies, from leading edge research to YouTube, and most recently overseeing shopping and travel at Google. He's a passionate creator, maker, excited about his family, Coda, travel, food, and photography. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you, Balki, for the introduction. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My talk is about how to make good career decisions. And this is actually a topic I've been interested in for a really long time. In preparation for the talk, I was thinking back when this interest started. That was over 15 years ago. Back then, I was teaching at the university in Germany, communication networks too. And I realized that actually mentoring students beyond just teaching them network protocols was something I really enjoyed. And I continued to do that throughout my Google career. As Balki mentioned, I've been a VP engineering at Google for over 14 years and only recently left. Yeah, but at the same time, I'm German and I'm an engineer. So kind of whenever I'm giving advice, I've always been thinking about what's actually the algorithm behind that advice. And that's, I'm trying to derive heuristics and rules. And in this talk, I've compiled 5 of my favorite rules that I thought are the most applicable to this audience here, that I will go through. But before we get to the rules, let me find my slides here. I find it's always very important that we basically level set first, because we'll be talking about pure first world problems in this talk. And it's important to occasionally be reminded of how lucky we are working in software, whether it's like as a software engineer or as a product manager or designer. How lucky we are, because we're in a unique position. We are in the right field right now. For the last decades and the coming decades, it's shaping the world. It means you'll not have to really worry about like putting food into the mouth of your family. In fact, you'll probably be able to find a job anywhere in the world, anywhere that you would want to live. It might not be your dream job always, but you enjoy like degrees of freedom that few people, like in the history of mankind, have enjoyed, and that is fantastic, and it's a great opportunity also to leave a good lasting impact on the world. I want to start, before I go into my 5 rules for this presentation, I want to start with the best piece of advice that I've personally ever gotten from a friend a long time ago. It was in German, but the English translation is on this slide. Love it, change it, or leave it. I'm pretty sure you've heard about it. These are basically the option that everybody has for any situation in life. I'll give you my own interpretation of those 3 rules before we dive into the specific, my specific rules for career advice. First, there's one thing missing here that is the most popular strategy or the most popular option that people adopt, and that is the complain but don't do anything about it rule. It's not on the slide because it's not recommended. That's not a path to success or happiness or change. So from those, the second thing I want to add from those rules, if you're in the lucky position that you love what you're doing, the first option, loving it, is not just a passive thing. Yeah, I interpret this rule as really trying to be active, fully embracing it, fully enjoying it, and maybe sharing the joy of it. That's the right way to execute the first option on this list. In the later parts of the talk, we'll be talking about how to approach the change it strategy, so I won't go into detail on this slide. The last thing I want to mention, in my experience with talking to hundreds of people over the last 15 years, is that the last option here, the leave it option, is often considered as a viable option way too late, like a year too late. And this is a mistake, because being conscious of that, that's an option as well for every single situation that you're in, will often lead to better decisions because you're looking at more complete information. So be aware of that. Also be aware of, because of what I said on the previous slide, as people working in software, we're in this incredibly lucky position that there will always be something else that we can do. The leave it option often has very low opportunity costs attached. So it's often good to at least be conscious of the fact that that's an option too. So now at that level setting, I just want to go into the 5 rules that I want to share with you. I'd start with the first one, which is understand your pattern. Everybody has certain longer term patterns, and they're not the same for every person because every person is different. It is important that you kind of, over the path of your career, figure out your patterns, because being conscious of it will lead you to better decisions. I will share my own pattern. I will be using personal examples throughout this presentation simply because of confidentiality of people that I've mentored. So I'll be using my own examples. My own personal pattern is the every 7-year jump into cold water pattern. And love it, believe it or not, in German, that is actually a single word. This pattern, basically, maybe quick visualization. A bit more than a year ago, it was before the pandemic, so closer to a year and a half ago, I was at Google sitting in a meeting with my team, and a new employee brought up an idea, a really good idea. After he presented it, I replied with the dreaded, "Oh, we've tried that before and it didn't work." And as I caught myself saying that, I took it like a mental note and said, "Oh, man, it must be 7 years again. I should check if it's really 7 years." And I later went home, did the exact calculation, how long I've been working on travel and shopping, and it was indeed shortly before 7 years. So I have this pattern that I need 2 or 3 years moving into a new area to really go deep and build the deep expertise. And then I really truly enjoy using another 3, maybe 4 years, building on that expertise and using that to drive change. But then I fall into the part of where there's too much habit, too much pattern recognition that gets into the way, where I'm not learning enough anymore. And I'm getting bored of certain topics and slowly frustrated. And that's how I know it's time for me to move on and do something different. The second part of my own personal pattern is when I decide to do something else, I compare it to jumping into cold water, because I like relatively drastic changes. And I know that most people don't like that. For the same reason, people tend to shower with warm water over cold water. But basically, I did drastic changes throughout my careers. That's just been part of my pattern. I moved from lower level networking research. My next job was building consumer-facing Gmail front end using JavaScript. There was very little overlap between those two fields. That's why it felt like jumping into cold water, but that maximizes the amount of learning I get whenever I take a new job. So understanding your pattern by looking back on your career and historic decisions will be super helpful to make better decisions moving forward. The second rule I want to share is it is better to fail at something that's very ambitious than to succeed at something that's irrelevant. And there's a lot more depth to this rule than maybe at first hearing it you might realize. The first obvious thing is, yes, if you try something really ambitious and it only goes 20 or 30% along the way and then fails, that might have still had more impact than something that was more or less irrelevant from the beginning. Second, there's almost certainly more learning involved, even if it fails, or in particular if it fails, when you're pushing the boundaries of technology. And that learning will pay off in the long run because you become a better engineer or a better product manager that way. And there's also, however, and Larry Page, co-founder at Google, said that many times in different phrases, but his basic advice often was, try to make your project bigger, more ambitious, then it actually becomes easier. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it's often true that the more bigger and ambitious something becomes, the more things have to be built. When many things have to be built, we switch to building mode more quickly. And that's exactly when engineers, product managers, designers, and so on, and all of us are basically playing to our strengths. So these type of projects are actually good for us. And there's all kind of secondary effects too. If we're talking about startups here, then the ambition will also relate to the amount of funding that is coming. It will also relate to how much talent the project can attract, and all kind of secondary effects that play a role here as well. Again, to give you a concrete example, this was actually one of the key rules of my own rules that led me to basically take the job at Coda. Coda is basically, I was talking to them last year, and they are based on two assumptions that both resonated with me. One is that the world is running on documents and spreadsheets more so than on apps. And I think that's very true. Even at Google, most decisions we made in a document and spreadsheet, and only later copy them over into easy OKRs to then be presented to the CEO. And second, the surfaces of docs and apps haven't really that fundamentally changed since 40 years. You're still addressing cells in a table, in a spreadsheet with battleship notation. So that's ripe for disruption. And the ambition that we have at Coda is to enable everyone to build docs that are as powerful as apps. And as I was looking at Coda, I started to realize, wow, that ambition is actually bigger, despite the team being barely 2% of my old team at Google, than the path that I was on, the mission, the ambition that I was on back then at Google. And that played a big role in me being attracted to the job. And in the end, taking the job at Coda. Now, this moves to the third rule. And out of all the 5 rules that I'm talking about here, this is actually hardest in reality to pull off for a number of reasons. So the rule is your next role should prepare you for the one after the next. And this is hard, A, because it requires understanding what you want to do in like 5 to 10 years. And I always found when someone asks me, what do you want to do in 5 to 10 years? That's one of the hardest questions to answer. But of course, it is useful to have some understanding of what you want to do that long out. And then the idea here is identify what you want to do in the role after the next, identify the gaps in skills and experience, and then pick your next role so that you close some, ideally many, maybe all of the gaps that you have so that you're working towards your longer term goal. The second reason, for example, go back to my own life. When I was in Germany at the university postdoc, I back then had the thought that I would want to become a tenured professor and run a small technology company on the side. That struck me as like a good strategy back then. But I was lacking the real world software engineering expertise to do that. I had done the academic world, but not the real world software engineering. So I figured my next role needs to be actual software development in the real world for a few years, and then I can go back and take that position as a professor. This is why I picked up the call from Google, and why when talking to Google, I insisted on software development and not working in research, which turned out really well. For me, even though I'm not really pursuing right now that longer term plan that I thought when I was 22 years old, that would be my longer term plan. I've matured a bit beyond that. The second reason pulling off this rule is really, really hard in reality is that kind of the forces of nature, the forces of recruitment somewhat work against this rule unless you're lucky. They typically, like a recruiter, a hiring manager will look at a candidate who's already succeeded in kind of the job they need to get done to then hire the best candidate who's already successfully done what needs to get done in their recent past. But that means if you just leave yourself to the forces of recruiting, you'll be repeatedly doing the same things that you have already done. If coincidentally you're lucky and that's exactly what you want to do in the long run, then that's great. But if that's not really moving you along where you want to be in the long run, then you have to really take this rule super serious and try to change course in picking the right next role. Number 4, this is and I call this the looking back on your life because I didn't find a nicer sounding phrase for it. This is the most recent rule, but the most frequently used rule we use in my family all the time. It's must be more than 7 years old. Maybe 8 years ago, my old boss invited me for dinner. He was living in Switzerland. He's from Northern Italy. We're from Germany. So we're expecting some German or Italian food. as we enter their house, they have this fabulous dish prepared, Japanese plates and teacups and everything else. And I mean, like, Susie, Jürgen, like, how come that you can cook authentic Japanese food? And they said, oh, you don't know. We were actually living in Japan for 2 years. And then the next hour or two, they were sharing all these anecdotes from their life in Japan and how awesome it was. So at one point in time, I asked Jürgen and said, hey, this must have been really awesome in Japan. And he says, well, actually, we didn't enjoy it that much back then. That's why we only stayed for 2 years and moved back. But in retrospective, that was the best thing we've done for us as a family, for us individually, for me as a leader. Yeah, that experience, we don't miss a second of it. We don't regret a second of it. And then, and I'm not exaggerating, on the way home, my wife and I were driving about 40 minutes back to our house. We were living in Switzerland back then. And we were discussing on what would we regret or not regret if we could look back on our life in terms of big decisions that we would do. And on that car ride, we decided, let's move to California. For me, living in Silicon Valley as a software engineer, there's just no way I'm going to regret that. Also for my wife, for our kids, we felt that's a good life experience that we will have. And if we hate it or we miss like water falling from the sky every other day or so, then we can always move to Switzerland after a year or two. This was about 7 years ago. As you can figure, we don't miss rain that much. We haven't moved back. So this is the looking back on your life rule. And that leads me to the last rule that I wanted to share today. And that is be as data-driven in basically job search as you probably are if you're in this talk on your day job, building awesome software. There's plenty of reports that you can look up. Project Oxygen at Google was the first one or the oldest one that I remember from 2008, but there's plenty of similar research out there that is easy to find that measures people's job satisfaction and what influences it. And practically all of the reports come up with a ranking like this here on the screen, which is manager has the most impact on that, followed by the peers or the team, and only the actual project only ranks third. If you think about it, it's understandable. Like a bad manager will make the most awesome project horrible. And a great manager might make a mediocre project good. Maybe not great, but at least good. Plus, if it's a great manager, the chances of the project being mediocre are not that high in the first place. The second point, the peers or the actual team that you're working with, well, you'll be ending up spending more time with peers and team, unfortunately, than with your family. So it really, really matters. And the actual project typically only ranks third compared to those two factors. Now, the conclusion for job search is, or the irony of job search is that most people obsess only about number 3, the actual project. They maybe meet their hiring manager. In some large companies, that's not even the case before they take the job. They rarely ask for references about the hiring manager or do a background check, even though that is the number 1 variable that will determine whether they'll be happy with the decision or not. So I often offer to candidates that are applying for a job, I did that before at Google, I do the same thing now at Coda. I'm very bullish about my management team and about myself as a manager, and he can happily provide you some references if you want to do a background check on us. People almost never take up that offer. But they should, because as I said, it's a top variable. The same thing, meet the peers, do background check on the peers and the team to the extent possible before taking a role. It's going to be more important than the actual project on whether you'll be happy or not. So this walked us through the 5 rules. I'm thankful for your attention, and we'll now switch to Q&A.
Yeah, what a wonderful perspective. Thank you so much. Honestly, you presented a very refreshing and unique approach to career management. And I'm going to share this presentation with everyone in my network as soon as it's available. Thank you so much. Folks in the audience, please bring up your questions. Just type them up in the Q&A chat. And we have about 7 minutes to cover those with Oliver. I am interested in a couple of things, Oliver, if you don't mind. So, how often, you can be as honest as you can be.
Yeah.
How often do you coach someone to the 3 options you started with, right? So love it, change it, leave it. Do you end up having those conversations with any of your team members? Like, maybe this is not the right job. You should consider moving.
Yeah. What I'd like to do is just making people aware that the leave it option is a complete valid option that's on the table, and that working in software, it's not a crazy risky one that they have. I find often that doesn't lead to them taking that option, but them being like significantly more relaxed about if those changes don't work out. Typically, the strategy is pursued in the end is to change something, but being aware of what's the opportunity cost of leaving, it's actually not like that big of a drama. So if the change strategy doesn't work, then there's an alternative to that. It often just relaxes the mindset and reduces the frustration because people realize they have more freedom than they might feel in the heat of the day.
Yeah.
It's not often the one that people that immediately pick. It's actually almost never the one.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, I do help some of my friends, right? So they're in the middle of it, so they don't see that as an option, like not in my company, but in my network. They're like, Balki, what I should do? Like, I've been here X years. I'm doing everything I can. I'm not happy. Like, there's an option.
Yes.
You're good at your trade. You can move on.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. There are some questions coming up. We'll cover this one question from John. John asks, what do you provide for candidates that actually want your references? Is it simply to connect them to peers to chat, or is something more programmatic?
Yeah, John, great question. I typically refer them to old team members and give them a long list of people that they can talk to who've worked with me. I've been spending most of my time here in the US working on YouTube and on in Google Ads on travel and shopping. Yeah. So I typically refer them to people, often people who've kind of left Google, so that they have a bit like the assurance that they are independent. Yeah. So, but I like to give a lot of names so that they can really randomly pick. And I'm also fully aware that not everybody will say only positive things about me. Like that's purely, that is also clear. I have to say, most of the time people literally don't take the offer, which is a mistake.
Thank you, Oliver. The next question is actually my personal favorite. I struggle with this every day, from Shrif Nada. And the question is, how do you integrate the ways in which you personally want to grow with what your company needs, right? So what's your advice there, Oliver?
Yeah, the first thing is being really clear on all the things in terms of your personal growth. Like being clear on what is other long-term things, because it's rarely just one thing. And if you don't get this one thing right now, then it's a big problem. Yeah, there are likely 4 different things that there are. It's much easier if you're kind of aware of these. I want these 4 things in the next, want to do or learn these 4 skills in the next N years. Yeah, if you're basically holistic about that, because then that makes it a lot easier for a good manager to find an overlap of where you can learn those skills. Yeah, being explicit about it and communicating about it is really important, because we all tend to forget, especially managers who hear a lot of these things tend to forget about it. So raising this regularly is also an important part. Yeah. Most companies, if you're in a company that is growing, which most companies are at some extent, that means there will be opportunities coming up all the time. Yeah, but you need to keep this top of mind.
100% agree, Oliver. And that's my experience as well. If the company is growing, it's almost guaranteed that there are opportunities for you to grow with them, right? So I would say, have an open mind, right? So it may not be exactly what you want to do. Sometimes it may be a twisted route, but it's still a growth area, right? So don't see just the next step, like I want to be a manager next or director next. You can see, what do managers do well? And even without the title, try to contribute in those areas.
There's one more thing I just remembered on that note that is worth adding. That is understand the why you want X. Yeah, because you might be saying, hey, I want to learn, I don't know, I want to do machine learning. but understand why you want to do that, because that's equally important. There might not be the exact thing that you want to do, but there might be something very similar that achieves the same why, even though it's not X, but it's close to X. Yeah.
Got it. We have 2 minutes, so I think we'll have time to cover 2 or 3 questions. So Tian Zhang asks, would you jump into cold water every 7 years conflict with preparing your next role to the role after?
Not really, to be honest. The jumping into cold water is the I'm willing to do drastic changes and looking for minimal overlap with what I've done before. Like I can tell you concretely, in the role after this one, I want to be more of an advisor. Yeah, and this part of why I picked the role that I'm currently on is because it closes some experience gaps, in particular working with a pre-unicorn startup, and ideally, if things work out well, taking it up to an IPO. I felt that was really missing. Yeah, but it is a jump into cold water that I had to do, leaving a comfortable large team position at a large company to build out that. So for me, the 7-year jumping rule helped with like getting the courage to systematically close the experience gaps.
Awesome. Thank you, Oliver. The next question from Marlon Moyer is interesting. As a 50-year-old senior engineer, I'm pretty low to jumping into cold water. Do you think it's still applicable at my age?
Yeah, I just want to first repeat. Rule number 1 to 5 is what I universally recommend to everybody. The rule number 1, my pattern is the jumping into cold water. This might not be for everybody to have the same pattern. Your pattern might be different, independent of your age. The key thing on that rule is understand your pattern, not follow my pattern. That said, the jumping, I'm almost similar age as Marlon. I think that actually jumping into cold water actually opens more opportunity. The willingness to do that opens more opportunities, yeah, independent of age, but at a like higher age, that's probably a good thing to have more opportunities to do, yeah, to do that. So I think it's something worth thinking through if that's an option for you, because it might actually increase your options rather than decrease them.
Agreed. And I'll quote your original quote, Oliver. It's love it, change it, leave, right? So you still have those options. So if you're loving and are able to change, you may have a longer tenure than 7 years if you're, that's my 2 cents. So we're out of time, Oliver, and thank you for everyone for the questions, and totally loved this conversation, Oliver. As I promised, I'll share this with everyone in my network. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.